When one studies World War I, little is focused on the generals, with all attention placed on the suffering in the trenches. The leaders of World War I are viewed today as incompetent, bumbling, and downright evil, with the generals having little regard for the lives under their command, viewing their troops more as toys on a map than people fighting and dying for scraps of land. No World War I general is as beloved as Rommel, Patton, or Zhukov. Besides Philippe Pétain, there is little known about the First World War leaders who led a generation of men to the slaughter. There is no cult-like personality around Foch or Haig. None of the World War I leaders are considered geniuses like Erich von Manstein or Heinz Guderian. Pétain is the exception to that rule, of course, but that is because of his role as head of Vichy France in World War II. People today seem more interested in his controversial rise and fall than his World War I exploits. The one true unknown exception to the incompetent, bumbling rule of World War I generalship is, of course, Brusilov, a man unknown to the English-speaking world. If anyone knows his name at all, it's from the failed Brusilov offensive in 1916 that took place in the death throes of the Russian Empire. Brusilov was more than a failed general, of course. Historians claim that he was one of the best generals in Russian history, akin to Surov. He managed to hold off disaster for years while fighting against three armies, with his famed final offensive basically finishing off the Austrians. Brusilov was one of the few generals in World War I that was beloved by his men. Despite his best efforts, though, his country still collapsed. Surprisingly, even though he was an aristocrat, Brusilov became a Bolshevik during the Russian Civil War, not for any ideological reasons, but out of revenge. During the Battle of Moscow in 1917, Brusilov was wounded in the leg and was forced to stay on the sidelines while the rest of his fellow aristocrats fled to the countryside to join the Whites. While the Bolsheviks occupied Moscow, Brusilov was forced to share his apartment with a Bolshevik party member, who he spared from execution in the trenches only 3 years prior. This party member lived the high life in Brusilov's home, eating whole wheels of cheese and drinking drums of wine while Brusilov and his wife starved in the other room. To make matters worse, the secret police threw Brusilov in prison along with his brother, who succumbed to his wounds. In an attempt to save Brusilov from prison, his son joined the Red Army, hoping that the Cheka would free his father if he proved himself on the battlefield. While fighting, Brusilov's son was captured by the Whites. Anton Denikin, the White Russian general who captured him, knew Brusilov well, and out of anger hung his son, believing Brusilov was a traitor. This was the last straw for Brusilov, who joined the Reds out of the desire to kill the men who hung his son. To begin, Brusilov was born to an aristocratic family in Tbilisi, Georgia on August 19, 1854, to a long line of soldiers. His grandfather fought against Napoleon in 1812, fighting from Borodino to Leipzig. His father was also a member of the Imperial Russian Army, rising to the rank of lieutenant general before dying of tuberculosis in 1856, 2 years after Brusilov was born. Shortly after his father's death, Brusilov's mother died as well, thus making Brusilov an orphan. Forced to live amongst relatives till the age of 14, Brusilov was then brought into the Imperial Corps de Page in St. Petersburg in 1867, thus bringing him into the ranks of the Russian elite. With good grades, he joined the Dragoons just in time to fight in the Russo-Turkish War. Upon the outbreak of war in 1872, Brusilov joined the Tver Dragoons and was quickly promoted to lieutenant for his bravery in battle, fighting in several brutal sieges where he found himself stuck in the hot sun with low supply and little ammunition. In these sieges, Brusilov came into his own as a leader, fighting the Turks sword in hand, leading daring cavalry charges. Several times he had his horse shot out from under him and was forced to fight his way back to friendly lines. After the war, Brusilov became a riding instructor at a cavalry school in St. Petersburg. By the turn of the 20th century, he took charge of the school and became involved in preparing his army for war against the Germans, believing them to be the true enemy of Russia, even went so far as refusing to fight in the Russo-Japanese War to preserve himself for the real conflict to come. Throughout this time as a professor, he traveled to Europe, viewing the military practices of Germany and France. In short, Brusilov was the only man in Russia who had a deep understanding of the enemy. Not only did he tour Europe, he reformed the army the best he could. As a result, he was made Major General, just in time for World War I. Before the outbreak of the First World War, the Western world believed in the notion of the Russian steamroller, that the massive 5 million strong Russian army under the Tsar would simply roll across Europe in an unstoppable wave. Of course, as you all know, the opposite would happen, on all fronts but Brusilov's. He was the Russian steamroller, the only general who was winning. The opening months of the war, Brusilov was made general of the newly created 8th Army. From there, he smashed into the 3rd Austrian Army, quickly wiping them from the field. In 1915, Brusilov advanced deep into Austrian lands, breaching the Carpathian Mountains and descending upon the Hungarian plain in brutal close-quarters mountain fighting. While Brusilov was winning, the rest of the Russian army was suffering defeat after defeat. On the German front, the Russians were encircled and destroyed in the Battle of Tannenberg. On top of defeats, on the battlefield there was little supply for the troops on the ground. The Russian general staff had foolishly only had around a few months of ammunition. As a result, Russian troops were given little clothing and equipment at the front, with officers giving their men only 1 round a day to shoot at the enemy. To counter this incompetence, Brusilov paid for his troops' equipment, personally taking large sums of money out of his personal retirement account to pay for his men. On top of paying for his army, Brusilov was the only Russian general that kept track of his own troops' casualty numbers in battle, which most Russian generals, even to this day, cared little about. As a result, Brusilov was loved by his men. But what made Brusilov's army effective was his lieutenants. Inside the 8th Army were dozens of future White Russian generals who studied under Brusilov. Anton Denikin, who later killed Brusilov's son, was in the early days of World War I Brusilov's right-hand man. The founder of the White Russian movement, Lev Kornilov, also served under Brusilov as an aggressive corps commander who pursued the Austrians to a point where he had a portion of his army getting captured. Kornilov was also captured, but managed to escape into a Hungarian forest and return to Russian lines as a sort of celebrity. Brusilov also did his best to indoctrinate his troops to make them understand why they were at war in the first place. To his surprise, the Russian peasants in his ranks had no idea why they were at war. To them, if their village wasn't directly under attack, they had no reason to fight. As a result, morale was at an all-time low. On top of having little training, most of his men didn't even know what a Germany was, let alone that they lived in Russia. By late 1915, Brusilov had to withdraw from Hungary due to defeat suffered on every other front but his own. As a result, the 8th Army had to retreat over 110 miles back to friendly lines. In 1916, Brusilov was given command of the Southwestern Front, and proposed a plan to knock the Austrians out of the war and to relieve pressure off the French and Italian fronts. Brusilov's plan entailed a combined arms offensive where his entire Southwestern Army would attack all at once, while his artillery shelled command posts, logistics hubs, and transportation centers, thus paralyzing the Austrians, who would have no proper means of sending reinforcements. On June 4th, the offensive began with the Austrians melting like butter. Over the next 3 months, Brusilov's army managed to advance over 250 miles and effectively knocked Austria out of the war by capturing over 500,000 prisoners. The only thing that stopped the offensive was the Allies, who failed to attack in time to pin German troops on the Western Front. As a result, 17 German divisions raced to Austria to prop up the nation from completely collapsing, but to the Russian high command, the offensive was considered a great success, with Brusilov being awarded the Sword of St. George. In 1917, the people kicked out the Tsar in favor of democracy, and Brusilov, who was sympathetic to democracy, joined the provisional government and was made commander-in-chief of the Russian army. Brusilov did his best to reform the army, but there wasn't much that could be done. With support for the Bolsheviks rising in the trenches, the troops barely listened to their commanders. Matter of fact, while touring the front, Brusilov was almost killed by his own troops several times while trying to rally his men to attack. After the failed Kerensky offensive in 1917, Brusilov was fired and moved to Moscow, where he retired from public life. When the October Revolution erupted, Brusilov was wounded during the Battle of Moscow. Under Bolshevik rule, Brusilov proceeded to lose everything and was thrown into prison. When he got out of prison, Brusilov worked for the Red Army for scraps of food. In exchange for this food, Brusilov wrote Bolshevik propaganda about World War I. Upon the death of his son at the hands of Denikin, he joined the Red Army and was used as a figurehead to try to get White Russian officers to defect during the closing days of the Russian Civil War. Near the end of the Civil War, Brusilov managed to get dozens of White Russian officers to defect to his side at the promise that he would protect them from the Cheka. But despite Brusilov's best efforts, the Cheka killed all the White Russian officers that defected. Realizing that he had no power in the Red Army, Brusilov settled for a job as a cavalry instructor. The only reason why Brusilov wasn't purged once the Bolsheviks were done with him was because he was simply too famous. Brusilov retired from the Red Army in 1924 and died of heart failure in 1926, a broken man.